All right. Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Thanks, Todd, for doing this. I had to twist his arm a little bit, but it's a really great story, and I hope that it's as inspirational for you as it was for me, because I've worked and known Todd for many, many years, and getting this opportunity to actually step through his background and what has made him a successful leader in this industry is a really cool story. So I'm just going to go right into it. Todd, let's start with your early years. Where were you born? Tell me about your parents. What were your original aspirations before you went to college? What was inspiring to you at that time?
He was really going to go at it, isn't he? He's going to start right.
I'm going to do it.
We talked about this. I'm like, I'm not sure he's interested in this.
Oh, yes, they are.
So I was born in the Bay Area, Northern California. My mother was the medical records librarian at El Camino Hospital, which is where the Fogarty Center is now based. Mm-hmm. And I was raised actually in San Luis Obispo, so small town on the Central Coast in California. Grew up there, small town, great place to grow up. My vision was to get, to grow a little older and to go to the big city basically when I got older, which ended up being San Diego for college. It wasn't exactly a huge city, but was much bigger than the town I grew up in. And my interest was originally I had early aspirations for medicine. My mom still has this report I wrote when I think I was in second grade on how to be a doctor. She still holds over my head. But everything after that turned into my father was an engineer. His father was an engineer. There's no physicians anywhere in the family. And so when I was getting ready to go to college, touring basically in a station wagon with my sister in the back seat with me, my dad asked me, what are you interested in doing? And I said, I really love, anatomy and biology. And he goes, great, biomedical engineering. And that was literally the end of the discussion. and I'm really not joking. I mean, that was really the end of the discussion. So I went into biomedical engineering, and one of the premier programs to go to was UC San Diego, which is why I ended up there. I also had a small foray. I played water polo through high school. I played collegiate water polo in college and on the national team. And so that was a big water polo power too. So it was kind of the perfect combination. And although I'd love to tell you it was all about engineering, back then it was really all about water polo. So.
And while you were there, you got involved in an early company. Right?
Yeah.
That was your first exposure to the entrepreneurial world.
So, my father, who was just a phenomenal and still is a phenomenal mentor, said, you need to get involved in something in industry, learn, get some experience. It's not just about the classes you take. And so I went to the job board at UCSD, and there was literally two guys and a dog that were starting a company that had come from Bell Labs. And they were looking for someone to do kind of strategy and some engineering work. And so I picked up the card and I ended up going to work for a small company called Pulse Metric, which was just north of UCSD. And it was a great experience. I learned a ton. I ended up working there for 4.5 years out of college.
And what was Pulse Metric?
So it was a non-invasive blood pressure company that was really trying to develop a technique to actually, way ahead of its time, monitor heart failure. So it was really trying to come up with a way to manage heart failure patients. And they had this idea, if they gave more data to the physician, it'd be better, which I think we all realize is not the case anymore. But we, like I said, way ahead of our time. But it ended up being an early stage company that we ended up raising venture capital money actually. And I got to pitch, and of all people, I ended up pitching to Tom Fogarty from 3Arch this is back in 1993. I remember the legend Tom Fogarty and sitting across the table from him pitching. And ultimately we raised a little money from 3Arch. And ultimately that was an incredible learning experience for me, and gave me kind of the inspiration for what I wanted to do in my career.
That's awesome. Also, that opportunity actually also introduced you to some other important people that became important in your life.
Yeah. So if it doesn't come out, I'll say it now. I think probably the thing that's been the most impactful in my career are mentors, Josh being one of them. Those are the things that make the biggest change, opportunity, and create the biggest opportunities for you in your career. And so for me, it was a guy named Tony DeMaria, who was a cardiologist, the chief of cardiology at UCSD, who just happened to be interested in something I was working on and kind of took me under his wing. And he's ultimately the guy that considered and told me, I think you should go to medical school. And I had kind of dismissed it, thinking I was going to be in industry. And of course I was getting older, and it was like, why would I want to go back to medical school when I was 4.5 years out of college? I'd be way behind. There wouldn't be the thing. And it's long training. And he was the one that really made me think, what really motivates you? What excites you? And he was a huge inspiration for going to med school.
That's cool. And it was just easy getting in from there.
No, it was this. We've had this discussion, obviously. It was very hard for me to get into med school. So I graduated in biomedical engineering from UCSD. I didn't have exactly the vision to go to medical school immediately, so I had to go back and take some training classes and study for the MCATs and all those things. And I applied to medical school, and I was doing this research with a company and this great internationally known, Tony DeMaria was the president of the American College of Cardiology. He was the editor of JACC, one of the most prestigious journals in the world, and I couldn't get into med school. I sent my application in. At that time, we were kind of an all-time high. For those who remember, you get kind of 92, 2000, 2008, what do these have in common? Huge recessions. And so it was really difficult. So whenever there's a recession, graduate school goes up massively, lots of competition. And so I applied to medical school and literally didn't get a single interview the first time, which is, means that I really screwed up. And DeMaria was probably the driving force that encouraged me to continue to do it. The way the cycle works, I couldn't apply the next year, or the cycle had almost gone by the time you find out. So I applied the second time. And it be honest, it chokes me up every time because I applied, I got 2 interviews. I bombed one of the interviews. The other interview went okay. But I didn't hear. If anyone knows about medical school, the cycle is generally that schools start, July, August. And by the time May comes along, everyone's accepted their classes in January and February, and I'm sitting in May and I have no option. Doesn't look like I'm going to med school. And I ended up talking to DeMaria, and he said, how bad do you really, really want this? And I said, the hardest thing in life is when you figure out, you think you know what you want to do, you've really decided, and they're not going to let you do it. And he said, well, I'll tell you what. I want you to get in a plane, use any excuse you can, and get in front of the admissions director. And don't just say that you want to go to medical school. Tell them why you want to go to that medical school. So I took his advice. I had very little money. I bought a plane ticket, a red eye, flew out to Chicago, rented a car, drove up to the Chicago Medical School, and sat outside the office for about 4 hours. And the admissions director saw me, and I took an abstract that had just got accepted to the American Heart Association. I said, I just want to update my resume. And I really want to go to med school. And she listened to me for about 4 or 5 minutes. And then she asked me questions and said, why? Why do you really want to go to med school here? Just like DeMaria told me she would. And I answered the questions for a few minutes. She said, okay, good luck to you. I left. And by the way, this was the Thursday before Memorial Day weekend. Medical school started in July. So we're like 6 weeks from medical school starting. I flew home. Got home on Thursday night. On Friday, I got home from work. And in the old days, remember the answer machines you turned on? That there was no cell phones or that stuff, right? You turned it in, it was like beep. And there was a message from the Chicago Medical School in the afternoon on Friday night saying, please call us back. But they were 2 hours later, and I called and talked to security. And the whole weekend I waited. I called Tuesday morning thinking, what's the news? And they never called me back. And when I opened the door to go to work was my admission to medical school. Mm-hmm. So big message, which is if you want something bad enough, you got to fight for it. Mm-hmm. And that's true to entrepreneurs. It's true of anything. You really have to be willing to fight for it. And it was one of the best lessons I learned. And the big second lesson was DeMaria told me you got in, now make the most of it. And I remember those 2 things probably is one of the big themes for me.
This is amazing, Todd, because knowing you as an incredible physician and leader, and to imagine you might not have been allowed to get to medical school is just mind-blowing. And I just think there's a lot of parallels in your story where, you've accomplished things, despite many, many barriers and obstacles. I think it's really amazing. So along the way, through medical school, there was some eventual interest in Stanford or what was going on with the device center with Fitzgerald and Yox. Talk about how you got
Yeah, so Tony DeMaria ended up being an incredible mentor all the way through med school. I ended up paying for a good portion of med school, still working for the startup company. So I was still working at night as a consultant for this company that ultimately failed in the long run. But it was an incredible opportunity, lots of learning, but it also helped me pay for med school. And then along the way, Tony DeMaria was mentoring me saying, what do you want to do? And he was a big imaging guy and in medical devices, but I really thought from my time and training and time I spent in industry, I really loved interventional cardiology. I loved the cath lab, the excitement of trying to really figure out stuff and take care of patients. And so he said, look, the two best guys in the field were a guy, Paul Yock and Peter Fitzgerald, that were at Stanford. He said, if that's what you really want, that's where you want to look at going. And so ultimately, that's what directed me to Stanford. There was no biodesign yet. None of that stuff had happened yet till 2000. And so that was really impetus for going there. And I interviewed there, and I was very fortunate. I ended up applying to my internship at Stanford and got accepted. And when I got accepted, I was probably 3 or 4 months in, and then they had a program that exists at about 15 universities, which is called short tracking, which, by the way, is long tracking. But you spend 2 years of your residency in exchange for 5 years of fellowship. So you can go deeper in subspecialty. And so you had to track into a lab. And so I remember interviewing with both Paul and Peter, and I was ultimately running Paul's lab for the first couple of years while I was a resident, and then tracked into cardiology fellowship, and ultimately had an extra research year, which is how I ended up doing a biodesign fellowship.
Right, exactly, and that's where we met. And talk about your biodesign experience. Maybe for some people may not know what it is, so maybe describe the fellowship. And
well, I just, as someone who, obviously the guy who started it, but ultimately someone who tried to follow in his footsteps and run it for 15 years after that, it evolved a lot over time, right? In the early years, it was, Josh really hands-on with, 3 the first year, and 4, I think my year, there was 5 fellows. And it was an opportunity to kind of focus, purely on innovation. Chose a different area to go into. For me, I was interested in cardiovascular. And I'll tell you, we didn't talk about this, but this was another big failure point for me, because I had this great idea that I would go invent something great during my fellowship. And I did this like 2 or 3 months of discovery with some of the leading experts at Stanford. And I brought the list to Josh. I don't know if you remember. He does remember. And I was like, this is all really good stuff. And he spent a couple minutes being very polite looking at it. And he said, this is 20 solutions. There's not 20 problems here. There's not needs. And the whole idea behind biodesign was needs-driven innovation, to look at a space that you thought was interesting. And of course, I proceeded to argue with Josh and lose. And it really taught me a lot, that most of our thinking, especially as a physician engineer, we think in the solution world. We don't think in the problem world. We think about what we know already, as opposed to trying to flip around and saying what we feel uncomfortable with and what we don't understand. And so that was a good lesson to me too. I don't know if you remember that conversation.
I vaguely do. And you eventually, obviously, I mean, as I said last night, you're an incredible leader, and you really, I think, are, sort of a powerful presence, and were the perfect choice to step in. I ran into this point in my career with, I made the mistake of creating 4 companies all within 4 years, and they were all really begging for my time. And I just was having trouble like juggling everything. And I felt like I really need to invest myself in my startups for a while. So I needed to find someone to come run the fellowship at Biodesign. And we picked Todd. So talk about that experience and becoming the fellowship director, and sort of, how you, and I will say the Biodesign Fellowship got shaped substantially under Todd's leadership. You really sort of reimagined things and brought many new things to it. So,
yeah, I think that, I think it got brought up last night, which is we used to have a dartboard with Josh's picture up on it. We threw darts at. So, and the theme I learned from Josh after I became fellowship director is they love you in July. That's when you start. They hate you in December. The key is you want them to still love you in June when you finish. And so his point was, if they don't hate you in December, they'll never love you in June. So I became kind of legendary for tough love. I was the tough love guy, which was, you're not driving a heart, you're not doing it enough, working with, trying to drive the fellows on their projects. What ultimately I think was, what my job was. And so I was very fortunate the first couple of years, because, I just finished the fellowship. So I finished my cardiology training, my interventional fellowship. I joined the faculty. I was in clinical practice. At the same time, I was trying to mentor these fellows. And they'd explain these programs they're working in other areas where it wasn't necessarily cardiovascular disease. And I would go, very interesting. Okay, you know what? Let me think about it, and I'll get back to you on what we should do. And then I'd run in the office and call Josh. And Josh and I would talk about it for half an hour, and I'd walk out and go, I've been thinking about this very deeply. But, over the 15 years, it was one of the best experiences I had because I got to see so many projects and so many challenges and needs and, defining what they were and solutions and a lot of the hang-ups that we all run into along the way. And that became the basis for me starting companies.
Yeah.
I became an entrepreneur because I watched others and saw and learned and got trained by people like Josh.
And I would just say, Todd, obviously is an impressive guy with many accomplishments and a tremendous success just in our recent history here, but incredibly actually really humble. When we first started talking about you taking that on, I remember you saying to me, like, I haven't had any big exits yet. I mean, how can I teach these people and represent myself? And I was just like, that was me too. I was there too. When we first started the fellowship, I had a few companies, but I didn't have any real successes to point to yet. But I think it would be great now to sort of pivot, because while this arc of, training and then running Biodesign and being an active interventional cardiologist, you've also got a thread that along the lines of your entrepreneurial experiences. And I want, let's just sort of step through those, the early ones, the successes and failures, who wound up getting integrated and attached to your world, and despite those failures, some of those failures still saw something in you that they wanted to work on your next things. Maybe let's go back to those early companies. Maybe what would it be? Venomatrix would be the first one?
So I started a company out of the fellowship. So very common thing was, you work on a project. And so I thought that I had this, really interesting area for, as it turns out, heart failure management, which was basically a kind of ultrasound patch to sit over basically the liver over the IVC and look at measurements to kind of manage patients. And I just had some experience in basically learning through Biodesign Fellowship. I'd had experience in industry as an engineer, but I really didn't know how to put it all together. And so luckily, Paul introduced me to Casey McGlynn at Wilson Sonsini. And he sat down with me and said, I really like this idea. We'll work with you. We'll help you. We'll support you. Didn't have any money. That was a common theme you would hear. And so he supported me and connected me to Jim Shea and Ben Glenn, who were two phenomenal IP attorneys that were at that time. They eventually spun their own firm out, but they're at Wilson. And so I ran up a pretty significant bill, filing my first patents. And then the dark period ended, and we found a patent that literally read on my IP that I'd filed that literally was about 2 weeks earlier, and it didn't look like we had a path. And so made the tough decision to not pursue the company. But I had this, I think it was about $17,000 or $18,000 bill with Wilson Sonsini. And I remember walking into Casey's office and sitting down with him, and he said, well, we got to deal with this bill. And I couldn't pay the bill. I mean, there was no way. I had a 2-year-old at home. I was junior faculty, interventional cardiology. I was working 100 hours a week. I just didn't have any way to pay a $17,000 bill or whatever it was. And Casey looked at me, he said, tell you what, I'm going to write this off on one condition. And I literally thought he'd say, you never show your face here again. You never. And Casey said, you bring your next project to me. And that ended up being a company called Bioparadox, which was a company I did with a guy named Alan Mishra. And ultimately, that's how I met Jay Watkins. It was De Novo Ventures that backed that project. Learned a ton. The experience I got was probably the most notable because ultimately, Bioparadox, like Venomatrix, didn't make it, was that I got the chance to work with Jay Watkins. Jay basically had us meet at the De Novo office every week, and he spent 2 hours with us. And 2 hours a week with someone like Jay Watkins was an unbelievable experience. I think that was also very, very instrumental in my development and learning. I did all the animal work. We developed this therapy. We peripheral vascular and cardiac, and we thought we were very close to a deal with the strategic, and ultimately in the end it blew up. We couldn't raise more money, and we ended up having to shut down the company. But I learned a ton through that experience, and I don't think that these two experiences were the whole basis for probably why I started at the same time Shockwave, which was started to actually, I looked back at some things the other day. We started in December of 2007. We incorporated in 2009. But the project started in 2007. So I was only a couple of years out of training. And I learned so much from the experiences and a lot of the failures that really helped a lot.
Yeah. I just want to dwell on that a little bit, because at that moment, you've had 2 unsuccessful experiences, and there's people who've been on that with you on that ride.
Yep.
But somehow you didn't give up. You decided to continue to do, to proceed and do another one. Like, how can you take us to, like, what did that feel like, and what was, like, Jay, remind people what De Novo was, because the firm doesn't exist.
So De Novo Ventures was known from John Simpson's.
Right.
It was John Simpson's venture fund. So it was 5 partners, and Jay Watkins was one of them. Yeah. I got connected with him by Paul Yock, again, Paul Yock, another incredible mentor. And so, why did I do it? I would say that they were all running in parallel, so I didn't know any better. I mean, I think that they were, much like Josh, who had 4 companies, I had 3. One of them failed. One of them is still going, because BioParadox went from probably 2008 or 2007, probably to 2012. And Shockwave started in 2007. We incorporated in 2009, and ultimately, luckily, still exists today. And so, to me, it was the opportunity to do something that was meaningful. And the way I was raised, my parents, the values was do something that matters. I still, as a child, remember growing up, high school, college, do something that matters. And I would say that this was probably the most important theme that I've kind of, along the way in my career, really wanted to be doing something that was impactful. It could be different things. I felt that what I did in the cath lab, operating 3 full days a week for most of my career, mattered, that I was doing something that was life-saving, and therefore it mattered. And the things I was working on, I felt like they were big enough and interesting enough that they could change medicine if I was very lucky enough to have them work out. And so that was probably what drove me more than it was thinking about the failures. There's no way that I would have ever gotten to any of the things we thought about at Shockwave. I mean, I took Shockwave to Casey. And Casey, ultimately BioParadox failed as well. Eventually, he backed that program as well. He backed Shockwave. I think he made plenty of money back, by the way. And so, I think that's the way it works. So it was a whole group of people that you met along the way. Yeah. And Shockwave was the one I probably met the most people, obviously.
Yeah. And I know it's an international audience, and there's a lot of different cultures and a lot of different feelings about failure. But I think I want to just pause on that, because from those failures came, the next thing was the one of the biggest outcomes in medical technology. And that's something really to just step back a second. Like, let's just think about it. Everybody has their companies here, and it's a struggle and so on. And I think the longer term view of the things that you learn from that, the people that you meet along the way and how you treat them, and how they treat you, really forms the bonds that actually turned out want to be fibers of your career that create a foundation for an ultimate success, right? So let's talk about Shockwave and the, sort of how did it come about? How did you get, what was your role? Who were the people that you then got connected to on that journey?
So Shockwave was conceived in a very interesting way. So Daniel Hawkins and John Adams were backed by 3 Arch and Prospect Ventures and a small little incubator. They had some money to start to go find a program. And they were frankly struggling to do so. So I got hired by Prospect Ventures, who I used to do a lot of diligence for. Again, theme of me trying to get paid to make money to pay the bills. And they said to me, why don't you meet with these guys and see if you guys can come up with an idea together? And the idea that I had was I was struggling in the cath lab with calcified coronary disease. I was doing rotablator, was training. I was a high volume coronary interventionalist doing a lot of complex PCI. And so the staff, every time you pulled out rotablator, the staff was like, oh God. And, there was complications. It was difficult. You've only used it in a few cases. And I said, this is a problem everybody has, but it doesn't seem like we have a good solution. So I kind of framed the problem to Daniel and John. We sat around, I wrote out a need spec, Biodesign need spec, and said that the fundamentals was it needed to have something that could ultimately dilate a vessel that was highly calcified in a radial direction. But the key was it had to be flexible and deliverable. And what I put as the predicate was studying interventional cardiology, and the things that I'd learned is that we call a front-end balloon, an everyday working angioplasty balloon, crossed 99% of the time. And most of the devices that were treating calcium crossed like 70% of the time. They weren't flexible. They couldn't deliver. And so I said, it's got to be like that, but it's got to have the behavior. And we all sat around and said, well, how do you treat calcium today? And we all went lithotripsy. And so ultimately that became the basis for the idea of trying to put lithotripsy inside of a balloon. And that became the fundamental discovery and invention for Shockwave. So at the time, we were a virtual company. I was still in practice interventional cardiologist. We couldn't get the project funded. We went to every venture group on earth. The original investment had been done by Prospect and 3 Arts, but no one, and this was the recovery of 2008. And so no one was interested in doing new investments and not a big project that looked like it was going to be long. And so we really couldn't raise money. So we ultimately convinced 3 Arts and Prospect to spin out the IP and give it directly to us. And in fact, the invention was really Daniel Hawkins and John Adams. They invented. I was at Stanford. I didn't want to invent. I did want to participate in the invention process. And so they ultimately drew up the invention. I scoped it and kind of defined the need. And ultimately, we put the company together. They flew down and we walked into Casey's office one night and we incorporated the company in 2009. And that became the basis for Shockwave.
And how did Fred Moll get involved? When did that happen?
So Fred got involved in like 2010, 2011 because we were looking to raise money. We had no money. We had $180,000 basically we'd raised from friends and family. And probably another proud moment is my dad wrote the first check. $50,000, my parents, not super wealthy parents and stuff, said, why do you believe in this? And I said, look, I've learned enough. I've failed enough. I really think this one really has a chance. And so, they wrote a check. We opened a small little 600 square foot office. And I said it was me, an engineer we hired, Tom Goff at the time. And I used to flush out IVUS catheters from the cases I did during the day. I bought an IVUS machine, intravascular ultrasound machine in Japan. It had shipped on a pallet for $500. And I built a lab basically. And I still have a picture that my daughter at the time, who was about 4 or 5, with crayons, which is I would show up to the office. I'd have amputated limbs for the posterior lower leg, and I'd dissect out the posterior tib. I'd put it basically in the water bath, and I'd put a balloon in it. We do all the experiments at night from the IVUS catheter I used during the day, because unfortunately, even as much as you flushed them, they'd clot if I didn't do it that day. And we did that for, that was probably 9-10 months. And Fred at the time had worked at Intuitive and now was at Hansen Medical. And he was interested in and had said, well, this is kind of interesting. He invested in different things. He saw our pitch a couple different times, and not till he actually was in Europe doing cases in peripheral. And he all of a sudden said, this calcium thing seems like a really big problem. He called us one day and said, what was that thing you were talking about? And he ended up doing our first kind of non-institutional equity round, and he became chairman of the company.
Yeah. And was he chairman when you went to that Bohemian meeting and met Antoine?
He was chairman when we went, and then it was Fred, Jay Watkins, myself, and got introduced to Antoine Papernick for dinner in the Bay Area. Jay really organized it all, and Fred was chairman. Jay wasn't even involved in the company that time, and of course we started the company. Antoine, we had this data. I presented it to Antoine at the Bohemian conference, basically in Istanbul. After getting beat up for 9 months of diligence, we ended up getting a term sheet from Antoine. And ultimately, we ended up putting together a really good group. And I think one of the reasons for success, I believe, for Shockwave was really good team, not just the people, but the board. Yeah. We had a really strong, and Jay Watkins became our independent. So Jay, Fred, Antoine Papernick, we added several other people to it. It was it just had all the right pieces to it. Yeah. And again, we got lucky.
Yeah. Well, I mean, but so it's just an easy course from there. Shockwave just wound up getting all the financing it needed, and
still struggled. Every round was difficult. So we were having dinner last night. We were talking about one of the experience. I think we all have PTSD of different rounds of financing. I remember discovering, I think it was the Series B or C, discovering some patent that was in some other language that we thought. I remember I was driving in Palo Alto. I was on the phone, and they're calling on, "You're dead. You're done. The company's not going to be financeable." And it turns out that the claims, when they got converted to English, didn't mean the same things. And we ended up having space and claims to ultimately be able to fund the company. But for those of you that are, you're all on this journey, I mean, it's normal to have the ups and downs. And I used to say that the only way mentally that I felt I could get through was the portfolio approach. At any point in time, something I was working on hopefully was working, something hopefully was going okay in the cath lab, and some other project was probably failing. And that just kept me enough mentally through the day. I think probably one of the things that was the most instrumental is that it was really, to the challenges of failure, of feeling like you put all your resources, everything you did into something, and it wasn't going to go, were scary enough that balancing it out with being a practicing interventionalist that day, at least I tell myself, at least when I went home that night, I did something that mattered. If everything else was failing, at least that day, that patient did better or survived, or their big acute, infarct, basically, or a shock or whatever it was I was treating, at least. And that really helped me a lot get through it, because it is a roller coaster. And those of you that most of you are in it, it is a ultimate roller coaster.
Yeah. Amazing, amazing story. So at the time that Mike Mussallem first approached you, had Shockwave gone public yet, or was it?
No,
it had not yet.
But it was, we had filed actually confidentially to go public, and really out of nowhere, I got a phone call that I ironically look back, I ignored multiple times. I thought, well, this is, I'm not going to call this person back. And it was a headhunter, ultimately. And then I ultimately got on the phone, and they were actually, and they were actually interested in Josh, of all people. They said, we're looking for somebody who can run this, but we're thinking about Josh Mapper. And I said, oh, sounds great to me. And they're like, well, we're not sure. Do you know anybody else that might be interested in this role? And I actually said, no, I don't. And honest truth is, and I ultimately found out it was Edwards and Mike Mussallem. And after a number of months going back and forth, I actually learned about the role, interviewed, was offered the role, and actually told him no, because we were going through, at that time, we were very close to the IPO. And ultimately, I was, in practice, I was very busy. And I think one of the things that was really, really important to me when I thought about it was multiple people I talked to. I talked to Jay, I talked to Fred, my parents, was, should I leave and should I go to the dark side? Should I go to industry? Should I go to a corporate? I've been an entrepreneur, and people said, I think to this day, I remember Josh telling me, what are you doing? But Mike really convinced me there was a big opportunity to do something very meaningful, that Edwards was going through the evolution of what they developed with TAVR and other things, and had this real growth period that they're going to be going through, and to have the opportunity to grow internally, to run the internal innovation program and external evaluation, evaluate companies and make decisions of what we buy and what we don't buy. And it seemed like a great opportunity, but I turned it down because I was scared. I was very scared. Things in my life, finally, Shockwave looked like it was going to go to an IPO. I was going to have some liquidity. I thought my practice was actually finally established. I was teaching and kind of established myself, and so I thought it can't get better. And so I was basically afraid. And actually, the reason I took the job was I used to tell the fellows every day, you cannot let fear drive your decision making. And I said, I'm the biggest hypocrite if I don't take this job. And ultimately, my wife and I sat down. She was incredibly supportive of changing her whole life and moving to Southern California, because Mike's big one lever was, you need to be on my team here in Southern California. That was not negotiable. He was willing to be flexible on lots of other things, but that was not negotiable. And so I decided, okay, what the hell? And it was her that really helped me make that decision, and took the leap. It's a leap I'm really glad that I took. I've learned a ton. I love what we're doing at Edwards. I love the things I'm learning along the way, kind of seeing the other side completely. I see now entrepreneurs, and I just think how I see things very differently of what's on the other side of strategic. And again, all strategics are different, but there's some common themes. And it's been a great opportunity to run a large group of, I have lots of projects of the things I like, but I also get to sit on outside boards. I get to make investments. So it's been very, very fulfilling.
I mean, it's amazing because at the time, Edwards was already a powerhouse.
Yeah.
Valves were just suddenly coming into their own, percutaneous valves. But you made it next level. I mean, everybody, I would say, people that like, how can it even get better? And you have taken it to the next level, Todd.
Yeah. So I hope we do. I mean, a lot of what you do, it takes a long time. And to start companies say, it takes a decade. And so I'm 5 years in at Edwards, and we're starting to peel the story out for other people to see. But I'm really excited about where we're doing. I think it's going to, we're redefining kind of the role that Edwards will have. Or in some ways, it's narrower. We're saying we only do structural heart disease. As you know, we sold off our critical care business and closed that about 2 weeks ago. And we're doing basically structural heart disease, valvular, and now non-valvular structural heart diseases. We have a whole portfolio of stuff that we're going to bring out. So we're really, I think, the chance to be there, great people, great team, and frankly, the chance to work for Mike. Mike is one of the greatest leaders, I think, and the chance to work with him. I spent 15 to 20% of my time, every day with him, just spending time with Mike and seeing how he managed, how he thought, how he strategized. It was incredible, and he's obviously now transformed his career, left Edwards, is no longer the CEO or chairman, but now he just put his name on the Biodesign Center. So he continues to make big impact on the industry.
Absolutely. I know we're at time, but I wonder if I can beg for 2 minutes, 1 minute on the future of Edwards that you see, and then 1 minute about the future of Todd Brinton. No. Talk about those two things.
So I'll be real quick. I am very excited about the future of Edwards. I think that companies the biggest thing is they get, just like Shock, but everything else, they go through evolution, right? Different stages of development. TAVR has been an incredible ride for Edwards. Such a successful platform that we talk about the triple win, big impact for patients, healthcare systems, and also for economics for patients and for providers. But I think that now we have a whole nother generation of stuff that's coming out that makes Edwards a much broader player in the structural heart space. As far as me, I'll go back to the theme that I've had some incredible mentors along the way. I mean, I'm unbelievable, have big impact, and I continue to have big impact. And for me, I just want to continue doing something that matters. If it matters, if it's impactful, I'm interested in doing it. And so, I am far from anywhere near thinking about the end of my career at all. I feel like I'm just getting started.
That is awesome and a great way to end. Thank you, Todd. That was an amazing story. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody. That was amazing. Thank you so much.